Hello, everyone, and this is the latest installment in the CPI public meeting online series. Here with us today, we have Margaret Kimberley of the Black Agenda Report. She's the co-founder, editor, and senior columnist for the Black Agenda Report. She's the author of a new book called Prejudential, Black America and the Presidents, as well as being a contributor to the anthology In Defense of Julian Assange. She works as a political activist in New York City and is involved in the Black Alliance for Peace and the United National Anti-War Coalition. So, Margaret, Kate me the fault on tonight. Would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Sure. Thanks so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to join you. I have to say I was in Ireland very briefly in 2018. There was a U.S. A conference opposing U.S. and NATO foreign military bases, which I had the pleasure to attend too short a visit. As you say, I write for Black Agenda Report, which, as the name says, analyzes news about Black people in the U.S., actually the entire African diaspora, from a left perspective, not the Democratic Party, from a left perspective. And the other groups I belong to, United National Anti-War Coalition, and Black Alliance for Peace, in a variety of ways, work to oppose US imperialism. Black Alliance for Peace in particular, our goal is to reawaken the Black radical tradition, which has been undone in recent decades. So I'm very happy to be here. So a lot going on in the US and around the world. So I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, it's hard not to sort of talk about the United States at any point in time, but for once it seems to be some glimmer of hope what's going on in the United States with the recent uprising over the murder of George Floyd by the United States state. Could you give us an overview of the Black American struggle going back to the 1930s, to the civil rights movement in the 1960s, the emergence, for example, of Black Panthers, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King? What's, I suppose, the background to what we are seeing in the US at the moment?
Well, as you just alluded to, there are many decades, many centuries of struggle, over 400. If you look at the amount of time that Black people were brought here as part of the settler colonial state in the early 1600s, it was more than 200 years of enslavement, followed by what we call Jim Crow segregation in the southern states, which is where most Black people lived, actually still live. People, it's very funny, people talk very glibly about fascism, and that was American fascism. The Jim Crow segregation, it was written into the Constitution. Actually, the history of chattel slavery, if you look at the beginnings of the country, you see that anti-Black racism is foundational. The fact that the Constitution was a pro-slavery document, the fact that there were so many laws that prescripted what Black people could and could not do, and where we could and could not go. But there was always a struggle for many decades, you know, even when things appeared to be at their worst, when lynching was a public spectacle, the effort to fight back never, ever ended. And when there has ever been any improvement in our condition in the country, it's been because of mass action. The Civil War became a war for slavery. Lincoln was not the great liberator, as we have been taught. He wanted to keep the Union together, but did not want to make it a war for slavery. But when the enslaved themselves began to free themselves during the war, it became clear that it had to be a war for slavery. When we look at presidents who are given credit as being supposedly good for Black people, we see that whatever they did, however little or however much, it always depended on mass action. So from the 30s into the 1960s, I think it's interesting. It's something that people don't talk about much, but it was the left that championed our cause, the American Communist Party, who championed the cause of people like the Scottsboro Boys, which is another story. Look it up. As young men wrongly accused, and it was the Communist Party who made their cause a cause celeb. After the war, again, it was Black people who started in the early 1950s. The movement began. Martin Luther King became well known through the Montgomery bus boycott in the early 50s. Also, the murder of a young kid named Emmett Till galvanized the movement. And it's this mass movement that brought about change in the 60s. President Johnson gets a lot of credit for his advocacy of civil rights, but he should not. It was the people who created a political crisis and forced change. But that change was followed by a reaction. He was followed by a conservative Republican, by Nixon. He ran, his campaign slogan was law and order. It was a code word for stopping the movement, basically. So a couple of things happened. There was a political reaction, or rightward shift. There was also a successful effort to co-opt the movement. There were some benefits given to enough Black people that it diffused much of the anger from those early days. The mass incarceration, system began. As soon as segregation became illegal, the prison system began to grow. Now the United States is the biggest prisoner in the world, more than 2 million people incarcerated. And I learned recently when Martin Luther King was killed in 1968, there were only 600,000 people in prison in the entire country. And it's nearly quadrupled now. So, so that's where we are today. And we have a Black political class and Black Agenda Report. We call them the Blackness Leadership class, because they are among that group of people who their class was created as a safety valve against the system. And so we have Black representation of a sort. Barack Obama is the best example of that, where we have Black members of Congress and other elected officials around the country. But as a class, they basically they give the appearance that we have some representation and that the system can work on our behalf. But it is more window dressing than everything else. And we're seeing that now in the wake of these protests, where their role is to say no to the demands while also giving the appearance that they are going to work for change. So that's kind of a few-minute description of history. I don't know how adequate it was. I hope it all ran together and it made sense.
In recent decades, one of the things we've seen in the US has been the hyper-militarization of the police force. If you look at images of the policing of the current Black Lives Matter protests and the Black Lives Matter protests that erupted in 2015, one of the things that it seemed is that you really could not tell the difference between that police force and any country's armed forces. Could you sort of explain where is that coming from?
Well, this was deliberate. There was a law passed called the 1033 program when Obama was president, which allowed the Defense Department to give surplus military equipment to local law enforcement. So police in big cities and little towns have armored vehicles. They, as you say, look like, well, actually they are an occupying force in many ways. But the people I just described, the Black political class, all voted to support this. Now that people have risen up, they're saying they're going to get rid of it. They're going to end this program. But that goes back to what I said before. If there is any change that benefits us, it's because of those demands. But it works hand in hand with the mass incarceration system, with the hyper policing of Black communities. You know, George Floyd was arrested because he allegedly used a counterfeit bill, something that happened to me a few weeks ago. And all that happened is the store said, sorry, we're not taking it. You got to, you know, give us something else. Minor offenses that are criminalized, and that leads to police brutality. It's a feeder into the mass incarceration system. Most people in prison in the United States have not been convicted of violent offenses. It's mostly drug offenses or more minor crimes that could be handled otherwise in a society that was more humane and more just. So I think it's important to point out that this military, and also we have to talk about it. Sometimes it seems off topic, but we have to talk about foreign policy too, and the militarization of the US. I spoke briefly about US foreign military bases. There are more than 800 around the world. Our defense budget takes up 60% of the federal budget, which obviously means there's no money to do anything that benefits human needs. So if you're going to have this huge military budget, then inevitably the police will become part of the military as well. So I think that explains this, why we have local cops who look like the Navy SEALs or the Green Berets.
And one of the messages it sends is that, as you were saying, that it is an occupying army in many ways. Can you talk about the US state itself? I know your book touches on this, with the election of Barack Obama and the famous slogan talking about change, which I think most people now see it for what it was. It was just a slogan. Could you talk about how the efforts of the so-called left within the Democratic Party, people like Bernie Sanders, who want to sort of reform the system and sort of bring Black Americans sort of into it? Could you talk about those type of efforts? Where do they come from, and do they have any chance of succeeding?
Well, not electorally. It's pretty clear. For the second time in 2016 and again in 2020, the Democratic primaries were rigged to make sure that Bernie Sanders was not going to be the nominee. And I think, in fact, the number one goal of the Democratic Party was to keep him from being the nominee. I honestly think they are willing to live with Trump. He's the perfect foil for them. They get to pretend they are in opposition when, in fact, they are not. But the thing Sanders was talking about, the country's moved so far to the right that the things he mentioned that were pretty basic reforms, raising the minimum wage. I mean, the minimum wage is paltry. The federal minimum wage is a little more than $8 an hour. It hasn't gone up for years. The idea of getting rid of student loan debt. We have this terrible system here where young people get into debt for thousands of dollars so they can attend colleges and universities. The idea that we should have what every other country has, a free healthcare system. But the Democratic Party made it clear that they wanted none of that. They didn't want to discuss it. They want to make sure it's off the table. They make sure that people shut up about it. And Sanders did not help by capitulating. I don't think they were ever going to let him get the nomination, but I think a lot could have been achieved had he stayed in and fought longer, but he folded his tent. And I think actually that has had an impact on the breadth of support of these protests. His supporters were, you know, all dressed up with no place to go. These are people who want to see changes in this country. And I think that explains partly the appeal of this movement across racial lines. But the Democrats have said there's not going to be any reform, and that means that progressive Democrats, left Democrats, however people label themselves, must leave the Democratic Party. And that is a good thing, because I'm not a Democrat anymore. I'm a Green Party member. But I hope more people realize the futility of trying to reform a party which has no intention of reforming, which thinks it's doing just fine, and does everything it can to crush any person or movement which is demanding change.
The question of justice at home in the United States tends to conflict with the question of, you again, as you mentioned previously, about US foreign policy, that in many ways what Black Americans are protesting against is the same as what, say, governments in Venezuela, Nicaragua, Venezuela, Cuba, etc., are also coming against. So how do you, I suppose, link question between the Black struggle with the international struggle against US imperialism?
Well, they're connected. And I think it's a mistake for people to focus. It's easy to focus on the case of an individual like George Floyd. I mean, how can you not witness this man's murder and not feel a sense of revulsion and outrage? But we have to remember a couple of things. First of all, there are many George Floyds, most of whom are killed without any videos rolling to tell us that it happened. But also, you're not going to have, and one of my issues with Bernie Sanders, by the way, is that he was more leftish about domestic policy, but he was fully in line with US imperial policy. And you can't have that. You're not going to have justice at home and injustice abroad. The same system that demands that the rest of the world either go along as vassal states of the US or be crushed, that the US occupy countries with these 800 bases, AFRICOM, US Africa Command, the fact that the US has divided up the world into spheres of influence and is in fact this empire. You're not going to have justice at home if you continue with a system like that. You can't de-link them. You cannot separate one from the other. And I hope that people, even in their struggle for justice, in this case against police violence, realize it's connected with so many other injustices, with economic injustice, and that it's connected with America's role as an empire. So we have to fight for justice everywhere. You're going to have it. You can't separate it. There has to, if you want justice at home, you have to want it abroad. You can't say, well, I don't care that much about the US sanctioning Venezuela and killing 40,000 people, most of whom are people of color, by the way. You cannot do that. So it is an imperative to link all of the systemic oppressions in a capitalist system with which obviously exercises imperialism around the world.
I'm reminded a quote from Che Guevara that he said he envied activists in the United States because they were struggling within the belly of the beast. Obviously, the murder of people such as George Floyd demonstrates an extreme level of state violence. And if it was, of course, if it was happening anywhere else, the US would be demanding sanctions put in and
Sure.
an intervention. The plight of Black Americans obviously is not just relegated to overt police violence, even if that is the most visible and most dramatic. For instance, during COVID-19, one of the things the pandemic showed was the abysmal healthcare system and how that affected on Black Americans and on immigrants and so on. Could you talk a bit about that?
Sure. Yeah, this medical crisis actually, it exposed the fact that we live in a failed state. But one of the things that became obvious very clearly is that this for-profit healthcare system, not only does it cost too much money, Obamacare, people think Obamacare was a national healthcare system, and it wasn't. It gave people the right to buy insurance and pay too much for it. There's still millions of people who don't have coverage at all. So when you had this health emergency, this disease, this new disease that the medical profession is just beginning to get a handle on treating it, obviously the people at the bottom were going to suffer more. So we're more likely to have inadequate health care. The hospitals that serve our communities are not the best. Here in New York City, we have amazing hospitals. We have some of the best hospitals in the country, but they weren't the ones that most of the COVID-19 patients went to. So George Floyd died saying, "I can't breathe," but there were people dying in emergency rooms who could not breathe. There are places in this country where the only COVID-19 fatalities were Black people. But that's part of, as I was saying, this larger problem of having a system that's in the grip of capitalism and corporate control. So the end result will be death for many people. Also, COVID created an economic crisis. Most parts of the country had quarantines of varying degrees of severity. People lost jobs, more than 35 million newly unemployed people in the last few months. And of course, that hurts us the most. Many of those jobs will never come back. So you had a health crisis that victimized us more, and an economic crisis that is actually victimizing the whole country. And I believe is also tied to the staying power of these demonstrations. There are many people who are hurting, who are very angry about it. And the spark may be a police killing, but it awakens this frustration and this anger that many people have experienced, because the economy was not doing well for most people even before this happened. It's something that's not acknowledged. The media don't mention it, politicians don't mention it, but people were already struggling, and the depths of their struggle have just intensified in the wake of the COVID pandemic.
The left in the United States, of course, the image, I suppose, is that the United States is a very conservative country, but anybody looks at the history, in fact, on the contrary, in the early 20th century, it had a very active labor union movement, a very strong industrial militancy. Of course, that was all undone by McCarthyism and by anti-communism in the United States. Mm-hmm. Could you talk about where the US left is now? How has it changed in the past couple of years?
The left here is, I have to say, small and not very strong, to be honest. There's still too much reliance on the electoral system, still too much wishful thinking about the degree of change we can get through the political process. And I think that's changed now. So the left has to break with the Democrats. You know, we have so much propaganda, that's the word for it, it's just propaganda, that we have these two parties which are far more alike than they are different, the duopoly, the Republicans and the Democrats. But especially with Trump being president, the Democrats point to him and say, well, it's either us or him. So if you don't support us, you're supporting Trump. And they're trying to drag people, browbeat them into supporting Joe Biden with this same argument. And his victory was used to browbeat the left. It's your fault that he won. And it's such an odd thing that the political party is not considered responsible for its victories or defeats. But of course, that's a means of shutting up the left and shutting them down. But too many people, I'm afraid, are still can still be affected by that, especially, as I said, with Trump being in the White House. Actually, Trump's victory is entirely the fault of the Democratic Party. I think that's pretty obvious to anyone paying attention. But as long as we have people with aspirations that are most definitely on the left, but they are willing to toss it aside in order to have a Democrat in office, the left will stay weak. But we have to mobilize people at the grassroots level. That's one of the things we're doing with the Black Alliance for Peace. We're not depending on the electoral system for change. We're organizing for change. We are making demands of elected officials about all the issues that I mentioned before: cutting the military budget, cutting the prison population, investigating all police murders, and asking candidates for office to sign a pledge. That's just one aspect of our campaign: no compromise, no retreat, defeat the war against Black African people in the US and abroad. It's a mouthful, and I remembered it all. But that's the kind of thing that we have to do. I'm not saying people should not vote and should not make demands of elected officials, but it cannot be the only thing that we do. And it's the only thing Americans are encouraged to do, is to vote. Just vote, just vote, just vote. And we are discouraged from doing anything else. But that is what has to change in order for the left to be to really be a force to be reckoned with in this country.
Reminded of I think it was Julius Nyerere, if I'm not incorrect, who said that the United States is also a one-party state, just in typical American extravagance. They have two of them. Which is, that's pretty.
A great line, yeah.
The nature of resistance, nature of struggle in the United States since, say, in the past decade, taken on the form of largely spontaneous movements, such as Occupy Wall Street, such as Black Lives Matter, and so on. Is there any, I suppose, direction or any sense of leadership emerging?
If you mean individuals, not in particular, but that can be problematic. For example, you mentioned Black Lives Matter, this spontaneous, real mass movement devoted to this issue of police violence, but there is an organization, the Movement for Black Lives, which came to prominence when Obama was president, and they are problematic as a group. Now, each group is independent, so I can start a Black Lives Matter chapter. I live in Harlem. I can start, if there isn't one already, a Harlem Black Lives Matter chapter. But when people think of this organization, it is very much dependent on Democratic Party, mostly wealthy people who are Democrats. They're part of, as we call it here, the nonprofit industrial complex. The founders of Movement for Black Lives are now dispensing patronage for the Democrats and for their donor class. But we can never forget that there are people all over the country who are struggling, volunteering, doing what they can. And it's very dangerous now because we have corporate America now saying they're going to give money to Black Lives Matter. Well, if they give it to this large organization, basically they're just co-opting people. And that is a danger in our very serious movement being popularized. And that's a danger in not having fixed, identifiable leadership. Of course, that means that anybody can present themselves as a leader. I suppose that's a good thing. But it also means there's no person or persons to focus on and to be accountable to everybody else. And most of the people who are thought of as leaders, the people who are most prominent, in my opinion, are not. They are people who, this, as I refer to it, this Black political class, who function as compradors, who function as a safety valve to basically keep the lid on and keep us from demanding the things that we need and we want.
Some people have been saying that this year, 2020, is this generation's 1968, in the sense of, think back to 1968, I wasn't alive then, but the sense
No,
of,
I was a kid, but I was, anyway.
In the sense of massive protests, a lot of political tensions, a lot of opinions being exchanged, and a lot of struggle going on. Obviously, the context of that was the peace movement for the withdrawal of troops from Vietnam, as well as the Cold War. Do you see any sort of link between there in terms of what this movement can provide for this generation of activists?
I mean, it is akin to that. I feel like it's still not as doesn't have the reach of that movement of 50 years ago. The Vietnam War was still raging. There was a draft at the time, so we had conscription, so anybody could be ordered to go to Vietnam. We now have an all-volunteer army, which was it didn't seem that way at the time, which was a way of making people less interested in foreign interventions. It was at the same moment of the liberation movement, and I spoke of how that movement had its victories, but ultimately was defeated. So I don't know that we want it to be like 1968. There was this huge rightward shift afterwards. So many things happened in reaction to it. I don't know if if the analogy is good, or if that's something that we would want. And people don't know enough about the history of movements, and to ask themselves if they want to have that connection. Would that be a good thing to repeat 1968? So, but I think there has been a huge shift, though. Something big is happening. The fact that Occupy was crushed, that energy is still there. The police violence, the economic collapse, all of these things have come to a head. So I think this this moment has the potential to bring a lot of change, but people can't repeat. We can't repeat what we did before, and expect a different result. Turning to the Democratic Party is that just dooms a movement. It's the last thing you would want to do. That's what they're trying to do, get people to vote for Joe Biden, who, by the way, when he was a senator, was one of those people responsible for expanding the mass incarceration system, among other things. It is a big moment like that. I suppose that's where the analogy ends. It can go either way. We also have to be aware of the reaction. I guess it's a rule of science, isn't it? Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. We're already seeing it. We've seen right-wing groups, white supremacist groups, attacking protesters, and doing so with the help of the police, with whom they are aligned politically. It is big like that, but it needs to be different. And that's why it's important to make all of those connections. It can't just be about police violence. It can't just be about inequality. It can't just be about COVID-19. It can't just be about foreign policy. It has to be about all of it. And when you have a movement that brings all of that together, that's when you we'll see good and true change in our system.
One of the things that did result from 1968 was not just the civil rights movement in the US, but also lessons from that struggle, also inspiring our own struggle in Ireland, for instance, our own party, the CPI, was a major force in developing the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association, which campaigned for equal rights for Catholics in the occupied six counties. Communist Party members such as Betty Sinclair, Madge Davison were very involved in that. So in many ways, it does show that the history of other struggles is also full of lessons for revolutionaries in other countries. One of the demands coming from the movement in the US at the moment is calling for the abolish the police, calling for community control of, if you like, the forces of law and order. Could you talk about that and sort of explain what that means as a concrete sort of a demand?
Right. Well, one of the reasons we can see there's been huge change, a lot of things that only a small number of people were talking about until really recently, police abolition and prison abolition and defunding the police, which is problematic. I'll get to that. But I think we should be working towards community control of the police, because we need the right, true control, the right to hire, to fire, to subpoena cops, to determine how our communities are policed, if they're policed. That is what the struggle should be about right now. This talk of defunding the police has become very popular, but it's too easy for there to be sleight of hand. And I'll give you an example. The city of Philadelphia just announced that they're cutting some $30 million from the police budget. Well, it sounds good until you realize all they're doing is taking civilians, people who do civilian work, and putting the budget for their jobs in other agencies. It's not shrinking the police force. It's not changing anything about how policing is carried out. But community control, which is a huge issue, especially in Chicago. There's quite a movement there, and in other places. That is what we must demand right now. And the people I mentioned, they all say, no, we can't have defunding the police. And so unfortunately, they give credibility to a bad idea, because we know they're not on our side. I hope that makes sense. But that's not what people should be demanding. That's not what people should be asking for in this moment.
Do you think what is happening in the US now is signs of a declining empire?
Oh, yes, absolutely. And we don't need an empire. And it's funny when Americans talk about the empire falling or failing, most people say it like it's a bad thing. We don't need an empire. We need a country that meets our needs and takes care of its people and leaves the rest of the world alone in peace. The fall of the Soviet Union made the United States the only bully on the block, and it's been a disaster for the world. Just yesterday, U.S. policy towards Syria took a dangerous turn with the enforcement of something called the Caesar Act, of all things, which increases sanctions against Syria. Basically, it's meant to ruin their economy, to starve people, to create more misery. They've even sanctioned Assad's wife. They sanctioned Maduro's wife in Venezuela. This seems to be the Trump administration way of causing enough misery that countries will capitulate and do what the U.S. wants it to do. But we have a system that causes misery everywhere, all over the world, in this country. And they do these things because they are desperate. And that's not necessarily a good thing. I don't know if it's true, but I was always told that wild animals are most dangerous when they're wounded. And so we have this country that is getting out of nuclear arms treaties that have existed for decades. The U.S. is getting rid of them. The U.S. controls its allies are all just vassal states, and they may complain, they may say they don't like Trump, but in the end, they end up doing exactly what the U.S. tells them to do. So they go along with U.S. sanctions against Iran, even though they like the nuclear deal, but they don't say anything. So this is an empire that is out of control, but it's out of control because It's failing economically. One of the reasons they're so hostile to China is now the world's biggest economy. So they may use COVID-19 to attack China, and that's the latest thing. Everybody in America blames China for this disease. It's horrible. It's ridiculous. But that's what a failing empire does. It tries to do away with any rival to make sure that, so it wasn't enough to destroy Libya and get rid of the secular Arab states. So fresh from that evil triumph, they decide to try to do away with Assad's government in Syria. Endless war, still US troops in Afghanistan, still US troops in Iraq, murdering the Iranian general earlier this year who is on a peace mission. So yeah, the empire is failing, but most Americans don't see it as an empire. The two wings of the duopoly are of one accord on this issue. They have a corporate media who never present anything different from what they are told, and even supposedly liberal media like the New York Times, or as an example, who allegedly don't like Trump, they go right down the line with him when it comes to U.S. Aggressions. So yes, the U.S. is an empire. Yes, it is failing. It's failing its own people. It gets what it wants only by creating misery and opposition to its policies all over the world.
Could you sort of expand on that point about the media? How was the US, the so-called liberal and so-called conservative wings, interpreted what is going on in the US at the moment? Have they differed much in what they're saying?
Not very much. I mean, there's difference about some domestic issues. For one thing, we've had media consolidation, and this is something that happened under Bill Clinton. And it's one of those things that right-wingers get when they have a Democrat in office. A Democrat can get away with it. So there were laws which prohibited, for example, you could not own a newspaper and a television station in the same city. And Bill Clinton got rid of those regulations. And we went from having hundreds of media companies to really now only having 6. Anything you watch or listen to in the US, unless it's independent media, is produced by one of those 6 companies. So there are fewer and fewer voices. We have a Democratic Party that's under corporate control, so they're not in opposition, really. And so they're like professional wrestling, these pretend opposition. And you see it in the media where certain things are just off limits. Any fairness in reporting on Bernie Sanders' campaign, for example, you never saw it in a major newspaper. Anyone who wants to say the U.S. should not be in the business of depriving people in Iran of food and medicine, it's off limits. Never get an opinion piece in the New York Times or the Washington Post. And by the way, the Washington Post is owned by Jeff Bezos now, the Amazon guy, the richest person in the world who may become a trillionaire, owns one of the major newspapers in the country while also doing business with the CIA. So that, I think, in a nutshell, tells you about the status of the media in this country, and they will allow some difference in opinion about things that aren't really of significance in people's lives. But the major issues about the economic policy, about foreign policy, you will not see many differences expressed.
One of the links between US imperialism abroad and at home was shown back in the 1980s when the United States allowed Contras in Nicaragua to traffic drugs with full understanding of the CIA and US surveillance state, that those drugs would go to predominantly Black communities. That was a major point of J. Edgar Hoover's COINTELPRO and so on. It's probably very difficult to tell now, But is there, during the protests, there was evidence of some protesters doing things, and then it turns out that they're very likely cops and agents.
Yeah.
Is there evidence that the U.S. state, for example, groups like the FBI, how are they intervening in what is going on at the moment?
Well, there are always agent provocateurs. Most of them aren't very good, though. You can always tell they're cops. They're like wearing the same shoes and stuff like that. It's sort of serious, but kind of laughable at the same time. People here in New York City who were arrested were questioned. Some of them were questioned by the FBI about their political affiliations. That's why it's so important for people to be part of movements and be prepared for these things. But the police departments, local police departments, the FBI, the federal agencies, they always work together. Towards the end of the Obama administration, the FBI came up with this designation of a black identity extremist, which could be anything you wanted. Basically, it was anybody speaking in opposition to anything going on in the state who could be targeted. So yes, we always have to be aware of their influence. They are now playing the role of protecting the right-wing reaction, and they're always out there. But I think that people are more aware of that now, and I guess that's why it's hard for them to blend in. But I'm sure there's someone who has succeeded in blending in and who has not been a clumsy provocateur that we have seen. So they are always there, always. And just the fact that so many people were arrested. People were kept in jail for days here in New York, many of whom hadn't done anything. The police just sweep in and start swinging batons and sending people to jail who may or may not have done anything that was illegal. We've seen violence on the part of the police. They've attacked journalists. They've attacked, here in New York, there were police cars they drove into a crowd. Fortunately, nobody died, but there's been a lot of that very obvious brutality. But there's also always the threat of a larger surveillance state involvement in any kind of mass action.
A lot of those police officers, past and present, would be Irish American, which is sort of always interesting to us here in Ireland. That a lot of those people would probably fit in very well with the British-backed police force in the north of Ireland and how we treated Irish people. How is the Trump regime reacted to what is going on at the moment differently from other presidents?
I mean, it's pretty much the only difference is that Trump is not as smart, and he says things. He doesn't use code language. So, but in 2015, a man was killed by police in Baltimore. His name was Freddie Gray, and when that rebellion started, Obama called the protesters thugs. And when he was asked, do you really want to use the word thug? He doubled down and said that he did. So now Trump being Trump and not as smart, he will claim that Antifa, which is not even a group, but he and other people have made people think that there is such an organization actually that is marauding around the country. So that is the Trump difference, throwing red meat to his supporters, making up a non-existent organization in order to scare people. But so Trump will say, he said, when you start looting, that's when we're going to start shooting, and that's why there have been hearings, I guess we call them, at the United Nations about United States foreign human rights abuses. So that's the difference. It's a matter of language and manners, but overall, Trump is really not that much different. I wanted to say something else about drugs, and people talk about the crack cocaine. But that was a policy of the US for a very long time. The days of the French Connection heroin, which because it went through Marseille after going through Sicily. But that was a US government program. The US set up the mafia elements in Italy and gave them free rein to send heroin into the United States. So that wasn't, I just wanted to point that out, that was not the first time that the US government aided and abetted drug traffickers.
And we're sort of coming to the end now, Margaret, but would you like to make any concluding remarks?
Yes, I would. Thank you very much for having me here. I'd like to urge your viewers to read blackagendareport.com. We have, if I may say, we do great reporting about national and international issues, always from a left perspective. You can follow us on Twitter. You can follow me on Twitter. Freedom Ride Blog is my handle. Please buy my book, Prejudential, Black America and the President. I'll show you, I'll hold it up to my head. I have no shame. Especially now we're having this tug of war about monuments and who should be honored and who should not be honored. And I think having that history of what leadership have done gives good analysis of, I believe that's a wonderful thing to see these monuments coming down, frankly. So read Black Agenda Report, follow Black Alliance for Peace, blackallianceforpeace.com. Check me out on Twitter and support our independent media so you know what's really happening in the United States.
Margaret, thanks very much. I'm sure we'll be able to get a couple of copies of Prejudential in Connolly Books for anyone in Ireland.
Sure. I'll send you the link. So you can order it.
You don't need to send me any free one. It's great. But again, thanks very much for going on. There's always a wealth of lessons from activists in the United States. As I alluded to earlier, it is the belly of the beast.
Yes, it is.
As we go on, whether it's Latin America, whether it's the Middle East, the United States is an empire in decline, and I don't think anybody will shed any crocodile tears for it.
No, not.
So next week, for the audience, we'll be having a discussion with Sarah Boyce from PPR, which is the Participation and Practice of Rights organization. She'll be discussing women and mental health. So we look very much to having another successful public meeting. Margaret, once again, thanks a million for coming on, and we hope that we can struggle together in solidarity. Thank you very much, and stay safe.
Thank you. Thank you so much.